Thanks. In Brazil, President Lula set up with Gilberto Gil points of culture, which weren't arts focused, they were cultural focused spaces right across the country, small, medium and large, which brought together culture, education, health, transport, and made all kinds of groups feel that they related to each other, rather than top down. And it was a real paradigm shift. And it also made the different ministries have to work together in a completely different way. And in your terms about nation building and having a different psyche about what community feels like, do you think it's possible to introduce really a different way of rooting resources and thinking in a much more group dynamic way than we've ever done before? Because I think that at the moment we segregate our communities and our resources in a very hierarchical and unhelpful community way.
That's Jude Kelly, the director of the South Bank. Let me take one just in the middle of the front row and then all that.
Tyrone Mills from the University of Essex. I understand very much your point about under-promising and over-delivering, and very much do see its merits, but do you not think that there's a risk that, given there is such a lack of faith in politics at the moment, that people aren't likely to take us seriously if they think, well, you're all lying, but these lies are at least promising something better to us?
Hello, it's Anne Brunton. I was just wondering what you think about the privatisation of the NHS that's occurring, and whether you think that the considerable damage that's going to be done during this government is going to be repairable. And not also that really, I don't think that New Labour were blameless really in this movement that this government's been given access to.
Okay, thank you for your question. I'd love a trip to Brazil to go and investigate these cultural hubs. It sounds like a very exciting idea, and I certainly think that where you're right is that in the planning of capital investment that we put in during the time in government, sometimes it could have been much better coordinated so that you didn't have different things being set up, but in one place at which, if you like, community is being built. Some of it happened actually in relation to the NHS, the so-called live centres, but I think there's a lot more we can do, so I'm very interested in what you say. On the question, Tim, thank you for your question. Look, here's my experience of this. New Labour in 1997 did make modest promises. So you might think, well, it's a counter-example to the idea of excessive promises. But yet, and this is very difficult to avoid, but I just think it's important, yet the promise was one, and I think this is why the disappointment was significant, yet the promise was one of enormous transformation. And I think unless, and I think a lot of people have said this during the time of the government, unless you convince people that you're on a journey, and that there are milestones on the journey, and that you can't promise everything, and you can't promise mega transformation. I mean, there's no point in using that language if you don't actually think that transformation is going to happen, because then it just leads to people's dashed hopes. And, in a way, I think you've got to see the disappointment with the government, our government, as partly a counterpoint of the euphoria that there was before 1997. Now, I'm not sort of against euphoria, it sounds rather humorless, but I just think that it's really important to be incredibly careful. It's a lesson I learned, because politicians who come along and promise grand transformation and then deliver modest improvements people are suspicious of them. So thank you for the question about the NHS, one of the most important issues that we face against this government. These are incredibly dangerous plans. In my view, I think they're dangerous in a whole number of respects. I think they're incredibly dangerous at the time when the I think they're incredibly dangerous at a time when the health service is getting a relatively low financial settlement, the lowest for a generation, because there's a huge waste of money in terms of the impact of the bureaucratic changes that are being made. I think it's incredibly dangerous because whatever the changes that we made, GP commissioning and the move on GP commissioning is, if you like, taking away, particularly if it's done by private companies, is taking away the accountability in relation to commissioning, which currently exists through primary care trusts. So I think these are incredibly important. I don't know whether you work in the health service, but they're incredibly important changes that we need to fight. I think it does partly need to be led by GPs and nurses and others with us, but I think it's a huge task for us in this year and indeed next.
Woman on the far end of the row in a white jacket.
Thank you. My name is Nita Devasi. I'm an MP from the Mauritius Labour Party, and I'm glad you talked about internationalism. Can you elaborate about how the Labour Party and the Fabian Society and progressives can take the leadership to collaborate with other progressives in the world, not only to make Britain a fairer society, but to make the world a better place to live in? Thank you.
Can I get a question from the top there? There's a guy with a hand up.
Thanks. My name is Sam Bacon. Ed, thanks for your speech. Really enjoyed it. I was really kind of encouraged by what you were saying about community organising stuff. Like, you used to be a community organiser, so it's definitely you want to have the party kind of move more in that direction. But I'm just kind of wondering how practically you see that being transformed. Thanks.
Thanks, and we'll take one in the yeah, just here. Yeah.
Hi, this is Steve Rose from Townham CLP. In the 3 southern English regions outside of London, we have 10 of 220 MPs. What's your take on this, and what can we do to re-engage in southern England?
So thank you for the question from Mauritius, and I think you make an important point which actually I didn't make, which is all around the world, social democrats are facing significant challenges and significant problems, and it is one of the sort of big frustrations internationally that while you might have expected social democrats to benefit from a time of financial crisis and a massive failure of markets, the opposite is happening. And that has actually been true historically, but it's true in this time as well. So I think that international cooperation is one of the things we're going to try and do this year, learning those lessons, the common lessons across countries, is really important. And I'm sure we'd love to have a conference in Mauritius. But learning those lessons across countries is really important, and sharing the experiences that different countries have had. On the question at the back about community organising, how does this work? The first thing I think, the starting point for this, what's the biggest difference between the community organising movement and the Labour Party in terms of the way people work in it? And this is something I'm sort of going to be spending quite a lot of time on this year. Well, okay, community organising meetings don't normally start with the minutes of the last meeting, but I think there's something else, which is that community organisers take seriously the idea of what volunteers and what volunteers need to do and need to be trained. If you think about the Labour Party, when you come into the Labour Party, you're not sort of helped particularly to work out what you do as a Labour Party member, how you can make a difference to your own community. And so I think partly taking seriously this idea of what it means to be a local Labour Party, what it means to try and change your community. And I think that's got to be the starting point of understanding why the community organising movement can succeed and we can't. Secondly, I do think it's about letting go from the centre, because I think if you don't do that, and you say, well, look, your only job is to go and deliver leaflets or whatever it is, then I don't think you're going to get that buy-in. And I think the third part of it, which is related, is about people's voice. People's voice and what our party does and the way it makes policy and all those things. That's what our party reform is looking at. So there are 3 lessons that I think are relevant. Steve, thank you for your question. I was in Reading last night, and actually I resisted the temptation to rush up to Oldham because I had a meeting in Brighton to start that process of winning back voters in the south of England. I think there are similarities and differences between voters in the south and voters in the north. I think we'll be quite careful about this, because if we give the impression that somehow, well, if you're in the south you care about aspiration, in the north you don't, or if you're in the north you care about fairness, in the south you don't, I think we're painting a sort of wrong picture of Britain. And yet at the same time there are particular challenges around the cost of living in the south, around housing in the south in particular, getting on the housing ladder is something I was hearing about in Reading last night. Part of what we've got to do, and this is where we can draw on the work, the Southern Discomfort work that the Fabians have done since the general election, is that we've got to understand those lessons. I think a lot of those lessons are actually about understanding that you need general solutions that cover the whole country, but you need to look at their particular effects. Tax credits is an obvious example. It makes much less of a difference in the south than elsewhere. One of the reasons I talk about the living wage, actually it could make a real difference in the south of England, as well as in the north as well.